Support for today's episode comes from Amazon. Amazon is working toward a carbon-free energy future, doing more with less, investing where it matters most, and supporting communities where we operate. Planning around bottleneck resolution is now a risk. The infrastructure constraints shaping environmental and energy decisions in 2026 are not cyclical disruptions waiting to clear. They are structural conditions with causes that compound over years. Executives still planning around their resolution are not being patient. They are planning for an environment that doesn't exist. Grid interconnection queues have continued to grow in recent years as new generation, storage, and large load projects enter faster than many regions can process them. Water stress in constrained basins deepens as aquifers draw down and long-term allocation pressures build. Permitting timelines have lengthened in many jurisdictions as community engagement requirements become more involved and litigation risk rises. Capital deployment windows narrow as the gap between committed investment and available infrastructure widens. None of those dynamics are temporary in any meaningful planning sense. Treating them as temporary is not conservatism. It is planning for an environment that doesn't exist. Structural constraints are conditions that cannot be resolved within normal planning cycles because the forces creating them continue to outpace the systems designed to absorb them. That differs from cyclical disruptions, which assume temporary conditions eventually return to historical norms. Planning for structural constraints means assuming current infrastructure conditions persist throughout the planning horizon unless there is clear evidence they will improve. Plans built on assumptions of near-term normalization are inherently more exposed if current conditions persist. The structural case against treating power constraints as cyclical. The grid interconnection backlog is the clearest example of a constraint that resists the temporary framing. CBRE Investment Management's Q1 2026 Infrastructure Quarterly documented that data center demand is expected to more than double from current levels by 2030, with utility capital expenditure among the surveyed companies projected to rise meaningfully through 2027 to build generation and grid assets to keep pace. Collectively, major hyperscale technology companies are projected to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in AI infrastructure during 2026, a substantial increase over 2025 levels. That is demand growing faster than the infrastructure supporting it, which is the definition of a structural constraint rather than a temporary one. PwC's Global Infrastructure Outlook argues that infrastructure assets require policy stability because investment decisions span decades rather than annual business cycles, and that political uncertainty and planning delays represent structural impediments that reduce infrastructure's attractiveness as an investment category. The constraint isn't a queue that clears when demand slows. It's the consequence of years of underinvestment in transmission, generation, and grid modernization, colliding with a demand surge driven by AI infrastructure, manufacturing reshoring, and electrification simultaneously. Waiting for it to resolve is waiting for a structural deficit to reverse without the investment that reversal requires. For executives with projects dependent on power access, the planning error isn't failing to anticipate the delay. It's building plans that assume the delay ends on a timeline the infrastructure environment doesn't support. Infrastructure constraints surface not as visible failures, but as partial execution. Projects approved but downsized, timelines extended without clear accounting impact, capital committed to capacity that isn't ready to absorb it. Water and permitting constraints are following the same structural pattern. Power gets the most attention, but water and permitting are following the same structural trajectory for the same underlying reasons. Demand growth that has outpaced the governance and physical infrastructure that serves it. In many high-growth regions, water stress is increasingly driven by long-term allocation challenges in addition to periodic drought. Allocation systems in many constrained basins were designed for a different demand level and a different climate baseline, and neither of those conditions is returning. Permitting complexity has increased in many jurisdictions as more stakeholders, more environmental review requirements, and more sophisticated community opposition have entered processes that weren't designed for the current level of engagement. Morgan Stanley's 2026 infrastructure outlook noted slower exit activity and increased focus on capital distributions as infrastructure portfolios mature. That same distinction increasingly appears in project development, where execution risk, not financing, is becoming the limiting factor in many markets. The compounding dynamic is what makes the temporary framing most dangerous. A permitting delay that moves a project's construction start by 6 months doesn't just cost 6 months. It shifts the equipment procurement window into a more competitive period, extends the capital carry costs on committed debt, and in some cases changes the regulatory environment governing the project between approval and construction. Capital plans often assume execution capacity is elastic, while in practice it is not, and this mismatch widens the gap between what infrastructure is expected to deliver and what capital strategies are equipped to sustain. What structural planning looks like versus cyclical planning. The practical difference between treating constraints as structural versus temporary shows up in how timelines are built, how capital is structured, and how contingencies are designed. A cyclical planning model builds timelines around when constraints are expected to resolve, then adds a buffer. A structural model builds timelines around what is achievable under current conditions, then asks what changes if conditions improve faster than expected. Those are different plans. The cyclical one is optimistic with a hedge. The structural one is realistic with an upside scenario. In the current environment, they produce meaningfully different outcomes, and the difference becomes most visible when constraints prove more durable than the model assumed. Capital structuring follows the same logic. Infrared Capital Partners' 2026 Infrastructure Strategic Outlook identified a mix of headwinds and tailwinds shaping investor allocation decisions, with execution risk and infrastructure constraint timing among the primary factors influencing where capital faces barriers and where appetite can grow. Structures that assume a specific infrastructure timeline are structures that require amendment when that timeline slips. Structures built with flexibility across a range of scenarios cost more to design, but less to manage when constraints prove more persistent than initially assumed. Organizations rarely lose projects because they underestimate a single constraint. Increasingly, they lose them because several constraints interact in ways their planning assumptions never anticipated. The executives separating themselves in 2026 are no longer asking when today's constraints will disappear. They are asking how to succeed while they remain. Sustainability Soundbites energy coverage is sponsored by Amazon. Visit the link in our show notes to learn more about Amazon's spotlight on energy. For sponsorship opportunities with Environment and Energy Leader, please reach out to a member of our team.